Long before the rise of Rome or the glory of Egypt, a civilization emerged that would shape the very concept of empire. Assyria, once a modest cluster of cities near the Tigris River, grew into the world's first great superpower. At its zenith, Assyria's influence stretched from the Nile in Egypt to the mountains of modern Iran, and from the Mediterranean Sea to the Persian Gulf. More than just warriors, the Assyrians were architects of innovation. They forged the earliest professional army, developed complex road networks, and engineered a postal system that connected their vast domains. Their military strategies and administrative techniques would leave a permanent mark on history, influencing empires as diverse as the Persians, Greeks, and Ottomans. Yet behind this legacy of progress lay a darker truth, one of relentless conquest, ruthless control, and a state machinery that blurred the line between civilization and terror. The Assyrians didn't just conquer, they transformed their conquests into extensions of their divine mission, believing that their god, Ashur, had destined them to rule. In a time when most cities still relied on communal councils and modest governance, the Assyrians envisioned an empire governed by divine right and backed by unmatched force. Their rise wasn't just political or military, it was ideological, a fusion of belief and brutality that would define their dominance for centuries. The story of Assyria begins with the migration of Semitic tribes from the Arabian Peninsula thousands of years ago. Back then, the region was not the desert we know today, but rather a savanna-like expanse that supported nomadic and semi-nomadic life. As the climate gradually shifted, these tribes were forced northward, some settling in areas like Palestine and the Sinai, while others made their way into Mesopotamia. This latter group, the Akkadians, mingled with the Sumerians, absorbing their cultural and scientific knowledge, and laid the foundation for what would later become Assyrian civilization. Early Assyrian settlements like Ashur, Nineveh, and Erbil arose along the Tigris River. For generations, these cities operated under the shadow of more dominant southern powers, such as Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon. Positioned strategically on trade routes linking Lower Mesopotamia to Anatolia, cities like Ashur evolved into important commercial centers. Assyrian merchants became known for transporting goods such as lapis lazuli, tin and copper to the west, while importing gold, silver and timber from distant lands. As Ashur's wealth grew, so did its autonomy, eventually breaking free from Babylonian control by the 19th century BCE. This economic prosperity also intertwined with their religion. The city's name, Ashur, doubled as the name of its chief deity, a war god who embodied the spirit of the city itself. In a world where cities often had patron gods, none were as inseparable as Ashur and his people. In its earliest form, Ashur was not ruled by a king in the traditional sense. Instead, sovereignty belonged to the god Ashur himself. The earthly ruler acted more as a steward than a monarch, a representative chosen to manage the city's affairs in the name of the divine. This leader, though from a hereditary line, had limited powers. He was held in check by two key institutions, a council composed of elders and an annually elected official called the Limu. The Limu not only oversaw finances, but also had veto power over significant decisions. This structure ensured that no single individual could dominate Ashur's political life without accountability. Such a system reflected a balance between religious authority and civic participation, unique among the city-states of the region. But this delicate governance did not last. In the 18th and 17th centuries BCE, Assyria's fortunes changed as trade routes destabilized due to internal warfare in Anatolia. Important Assyrian colonies such as Karum-Kanesh were destroyed, leading to a sharp economic downturn. Ashur, stripped of its prosperity, fell once again under Babylonian control. This marked a return to subjugation and signaled a pause in Assyria's ambitions. However, the seeds of empire had already been planted, lying dormant beneath the surface, waiting for a future ruler bold enough to awaken them. The following centuries saw Assyria tossed between foreign dominations and fleeting moments of autonomy. After Babylon's decline, new powers emerged, most notably the Mitanni kingdom, established by Indo-Aryan elites from the Armenian highlands. Though nominally independent, Ashur and its people became vassals once again, this time under Mitanni influence. The city's walls were dismantled by order of their overlords, its ability to defend itself effectively neutralized. Representatives from Mitanni even held seats on Ashur's governing council, ensuring their dominance over key decisions. Yet this period was not entirely bleak. The Assyrians learned and adapted, incorporating advanced military techniques from their rulers, including the use of composite bows, lamellar armor, and the formidable light chariot. These innovations would later play a crucial role in their rise to power. By the 15th and 14th centuries BCE, Mitanni power began to crumble under internal conflict. Seeing an opportunity, Assyrian leaders reasserted control. King Ashur-uballit I declared independence, expelled Mitanni envoys, and formed an alliance with Egypt to fortify Assyria's new status. His bold stance, backed by diplomatic cunning, redefined Assyria's identity. No longer a trading city or vassal, it began presenting itself as a territorial state, an organized kingdom with expansionist aspirations. The age of city-states was ending, and the age of empires was about to begin, with Assyria at its center. With its independence secured, Assyria underwent a profound transformation in ideology and governance. No longer merely a city governed. By divine stewardship, it now embraced the concept of a kingdom ordained to rule. The rulers began referring to themselves with grander titles, no longer just kings of Ashur, but kings of the world. This shift was more than symbolic. It redefined the state's purpose. Expansion was now viewed not as ambition, but as obligation. The god Ashur was no longer simply a patron of one city. He had become the supreme deity, the god above all gods. And if Ashur was the god of the universe, then it followed that the Assyrian king, as his earthly instrument, had the divine right to dominate all peoples. The new royal ideology held that Assyria's expansion brought cosmic order to lands trapped in chaos. To resist Assyrian control was not just rebellion, it was heresy. Under kings like Adad-nirari, this belief translated into relentless military campaigns. Territories that had once been independent or loosely affiliated were annexed, their rulers forced to kneel and acknowledge the supremacy of Assyria. The concept of carrying the yoke of Ashur became a political and spiritual mantra, legitimizing conquest as sacred duty. Thus began the long march toward empire, justified not only by power, but by purpose. As we retrace the rise of Assyria from a modest trading city to a global empire, it's hard not to admire the vision that fueled their journey. And speaking of vision, our own is to reach 1,000 subscribers by June 30th. If you're enjoying the story so far and want to support this project, your subscription means the world to us. This ideology of divine conquest soon materialized into territorial domination. The collapse of the Mitanni state gave Assyria a clear path for expansion, and its kings seized the opportunity with unwavering force. Adad-nirari began the process, but it was his successors, like Shalmaneser I and Tukulti-Ninurta who pushed Assyria into its first imperial age. Tukulti-Ninurta achieved a landmark victory by defeating Babylon and capturing its king, a symbolic act that declared Assyria as the new center of Mesopotamian power. He expanded northward as well, dealing crushing blows to the Hittites. For a moment, it seemed Assyria was unstoppable, but internal strife cut this ascent short. Tukulti-Ninurta was assassinated in a palace coup, and the empire he built quickly fragmented. Amid the widespread instability of the late Bronze Age collapse, a period when great powers like Mycenae and the Hittites crumbled, Assyria, too, retracted. It retreated into a core territory along the Tigris River, maintaining only a shell of its former reach. And yet, unlike many of its contemporaries, it did not fall. It endured. Its military traditions, administrative systems, and divine ideology remained intact. They would serve as the foundation for a resurgence that, when it came, would be fiercer and more far-reaching than anything the ancient world had yet seen. The Assyrian revival began in the 10th century BCE, sparked by a series of rulers, determined to reclaim the glory of their forebears. It started cautiously, with defensive campaigns aimed at fending off raiders from neighboring tribes, the Arameans from the west, the Nairi from the north, and various peoples from the Iranian plateau. But under the leadership of kings like Ashur II and his successors, these preemptive measures evolved into full-scale offensives. Assyria was no longer content with survival, it sought dominance. One of the pillars of this renewed strength was innovation. The Assyrians pioneered the use of cavalry, introducing horse-mounted archers and eventually heavy shock troops that would serve as early models for future cataphracts. They revolutionized siege warfare by employing battering rams, tunneling beneath city walls, and constructing mobile towers filled with archers. These tools allowed them to breach fortified cities that other armies could only hope to starve into submission. They also introduced one of the world's first organized postal networks, enabling rapid communication between far-flung garrisons and the central government. Paved roads facilitated not only the movement of messages, but also the swift deployment of troops, reinforcing Assyria's hold over its expanding realm. These advances weren't just tactical. They were systemic, designed to sustain continuous warfare and administration on a scale the ancient world had never seen. As Assyria's military machine grew more sophisticated, so too did its need for resources. Without a formal tax system in place, the empire came to rely on war itself as its primary engine of revenue. Annual campaigns became institutionalized, with each year's objective centered on expanding borders and extracting wealth from subjugated territories. The reign of Ashur-Nasirpal II exemplified this brutal efficiency. His campaigns were not just aimed at conquest, but at instilling terror. The king himself boasted of building towers from severed heads, impaling young men on stakes and burning captives alive. These horrific acts weren't acts of madness. They were deliberate psychological warfare intended to break the spirit of any who might resist. The fear generated by such cruelty often led entire cities to surrender without a fight, accepting Assyrian rule in exchange for survival. Yet this approach came with a cost. While it brought short-term gains and rapid expansion, it also sowed deep and enduring hatred among neighboring peoples. Over time, this legacy of violence would prove to be a double-edged sword. For now, however, it worked. Assyria grew richer, its grip on the Near East tightening with each campaign. Cities paid tribute in gold, livestock, and people. Governors were installed in conquered lands and kept in check through the very postal system that linked the empire. From its capital, Assyria ruled not just through power, but through fear. But even as Assyria's dominion expanded, the foundations of its power began to show cracks. The reliance on fear as a governing tool gradually bred not submission, but resentment. Though some kingdoms yielded without resistance, others began to quietly organize, waiting for a moment of weakness. The empire's insatiable hunger for conquest led to widespread devastation. Farmlands were razed, populations displaced, and cities emptied of their youth. The very resources Assyria needed to sustain itself were being drained by the endless demands of war. Provincial governors, once loyal to the throne, began acting independently, exploiting their positions to amass personal power. The central authority found itself increasingly unable to rein in the ambitions of its own officials. Worse still, internal strife took hold. Factions within the royal court clashed for influence, while military commanders began questioning the competence of the kings they served. Despite these growing tensions, Assyria continued its aggressive campaigns. Shalmaneser III, one of its most ambitious rulers, expanded westward and forced kingdoms like Israel, Judah, and Phoenicia into tributary status. His inscriptions often describe cities falling into panic at the mere sight of the Assyrian army. But behind the triumphs, the cost of maintaining such dominance was mounting. The empire was beginning to overextend, and the enemies it once cowed into submission were now watching and waiting. The tide began to turn in the 8th century BCE when King Tiglath-Pileser III rose to power through a military coup. Recognizing the dangers of a fragmented empire, he set out to reform it from within. His first move was radical. He dismantled the old militia system and created the first truly professional standing army in Assyrian history. Soldiers were no longer landowners summoned for seasonal campaigns. They were full-time warriors, trained, armed, and paid by the state. This new force brought discipline and order to the battlefield and became the backbone of a renewed wave of conquests. Tiglath-Pileser also tackled the administrative chaos that plagued the empire. He imposed standardized taxes on farmers and craftsmen and restructured the provinces, reducing their size and increasing their number to prevent any one governor from becoming too powerful. Notably, he appointed eunuchs as provincial leaders, officials who, because they had no heirs, posed no dynastic threat to the central throne. With these reforms, Assyria was reborn. The empire surged outward once more, this time with calculated precision. Whole populations were deported from their homelands and resettled across the empire in a strategy known as nashu, or uprooting. The objective was clear: break cultural bonds, erase identities, and replace resistance with dependency. And although brutal, it worked. Assyria became more stable and more feared than ever before. Tiglath-Pileser III's policy of forced displacement reshaped the demographic landscape of the Near East. By scattering conquered populations and replacing them with captives from other regions, Assyria aimed to eliminate local loyalties and potential uprisings. Ironically, this strategy had an unintended consequence. It facilitated the spread of Aramaic culture and language. As Aramean tribes were relocated across the empire, their language took root in cities, villages, and administrative centers. Over time, Aramaic, not Assyrian, became the lingua franca of the region. Even in the Assyrian heartland, scribes were soon seen recording documents in both Akkadian and Aramaic. Reliefs from this period often depict two scribes working side by side, one carving in clay tablets, the other writing on papyrus. Despite these cultural shifts, Tiglath-Pileser's policies proved overwhelmingly effective in consolidating Assyrian power. He subdued rebellious tribes in Babylonia, launched successful campaigns against the Medes in the Iranian plateau, and pushed westward to crush the powerful kingdom of Urartu. In 743 BCE, the Battle of Arpad marked a turning point. The Assyrians overwhelmed a formidable coalition of Urartians and Arameans. The victory was so complete that many Levantine states surrendered without resistance, offering tribute in gold and silver rather than face destruction. Tiglath-Pileser had turned Assyria into a machine of conquest, but this time one held together by bureaucracy as much as by terror. Assyria's dominance reached new heights under Tiglath-Pileser's successors, who followed his model with unwavering dedication. In 732 BCE, he launched another campaign into the Levant, conquering Damascus and reducing the kingdoms of Israel and Judah to vassal states. Even the Phoenician city-states, long known for their wealth and maritime power, submitted to Assyrian supremacy. The city of Tyre, for example, avoided destruction only by paying an enormous tribute, over 4 tons of gold. The Assyrian army advanced to the very edge of Egypt, capturing the Philistine capital of Ashkelon along the Way. In 729 BCE, Tiglath-Pileser completed one of his boldest moves. He crowned himself king of Babylon, uniting two historically rival civilizations under a single crown. This political fusion marked the birth of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, a vast domain stretching from the mountains of Armenia to the deserts of Egypt, and from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. His reign demonstrated that Assyria was no longer a regional power, but a global empire in ancient terms. The fusion of military innovation, administrative reform, and psychological warfare had forged a state that could exert control over diverse peoples and lands. But while this system brought stability and wealth, it also masked growing fractures beneath the surface. Fractures that future rulers would either have to mend or be consumed by. Following Tiglath-Pileser III's death, his successors, Shalmaneser V, Sargon II, and Sennacherib, continued his imperial policies, expanding Assyria's borders to their greatest extent. Under Sargon II, the empire defeated Urartu in the north, quelled Phoenician rebellions in the west, and conquered the island of Cyprus. Egypt, long a rival power, also fell under Assyrian control. Sargon's successor, Sennacherib, famously razed Babylon to the ground in 689 BCE after yet another rebellion, demolishing temples, deporting the population, and flooding the ruins with water from the Euphrates. Though the act shocked the ancient world, it reflected the empire's unforgiving stance toward dissent. The city was later rebuilt by Esarhaddon, who aimed to stabilize relations in the region. During his reign, Assyria reached the zenith of its political and military power. Esarhaddon even conquered Egypt in a swift campaign, placing it under Assyrian rule and appointing vassal pharaohs to govern in the empire's name. At this point, the Assyrian kings ruled over nearly every major kingdom of the Near East. Their word carried divine authority, and their enemies had been scattered, subjugated, or destroyed. Yet with each new conquest came new responsibilities. The burden of managing such a vast and culturally diverse realm began to weigh heavily. While the empire appeared invincible from the outside, inside it was growing brittle, stretched to its limits by the very ambition that had made it great. Esarhaddon made a fateful decision in 672 BCE when he divided the empire between his sons. Ashurbanipal was named king of Assyria, while his brother Shamash-shum-ukin was appointed king of Babylon. Though the move was meant to maintain peace and satisfy Babylonian elites, since Shamash's mother was Babylonian, it planted the seeds of civil war. In Assyria, the dual monarchy was viewed with suspicion, and some court officials openly expressed concern. One priest even warned Esarhaddon in a surviving letter that his arrangement would bring ruin to the land of Ashur. The prophecy would come true. Although Ashurbanipal held real power, Shamash-shum-ukin began cultivating alliances with groups hostile to Assyrian rule: Elamites, Chaldeans, Arabs, and even some Medes and Egyptians. For a time, outward peace prevailed, but tensions simmered beneath the surface. In 652 BCE, Shamash-shum-ukin launched a full-scale rebellion, declaring Babylon's independence. Yet his grand coalition collapsed almost immediately. Egypt offered no aid, Lydia was distracted by invasions, and the remaining allies lacked coordination. Ashurbanipal's forces crushed the rebellion with ruthless precision. Babylon fell in 648 BCE after a brutal siege, and Shamash-shum-ukin took his own life rather than be captured. The Assyrians exacted terrible revenge, mutilating rebels, burning cities, and publicly displaying severed heads. Once again, Assyria proved its might. But the internal wounds from this civil conflict would never fully heal. Despite his victory over his brother, Ashurbanipal's reign marked the beginning of Assyria's irreversible decline. Though outwardly triumphant, the empire had exhausted itself. Its military campaigns, once driven by ambition, had become reactions to rebellions and external threats. The lands that had once filled Assyria's coffers were now scorched, depopulated, and economically ruined. Trade routes faltered, agricultural output dropped, and the central government struggled to maintain control over its governors and generals. The once mighty postal system and network of paved roads could not compensate for the growing instability. The Medes in the east and Scythians from the north began to probe Assyria's borders, sensing weakness. Even long-subdued regions like Egypt and Elam slipped from its grasp, reclaiming their autonomy. Within Assyria, resentment grew among the military elite and provincial administrators, many of whom began acting independently. The centralized control that Tiglath-Pileser III had painstakingly built was unraveling. By the time Ashurbanipal died in 627 BCE, the empire was a hollow shell of its former self. A civil war broke out almost immediately between his sons and their factions, fracturing the already weakened state. The great machine that had once dominated the ancient world was beginning to collapse under its own weight, drained by centuries of war, rebellion, and relentless expansion. The fall of Nineveh marked the end of an era, but not of the lessons it left behind. If this exploration of history is resonating with you, take a second to like this video and follow the channel. That simple action helps us bring more of these powerful stories to light. As the civil war raged, a new leader emerged from the ruins of Babylon, Nabopolassar, a Chaldean prince who declared independence from Assyria and launched a campaign of liberation. His timing was perfect. The Assyrian military, divided and demoralized, was in no condition to repel a well-organized resistance. Nabopolassar quickly secured control over Babylonia and allied with the Medes, whose king, Cyaxares, harbored his own ambitions against Assyria. In 612 BCE, their combined forces marched on the empire's heart. First, they captured and destroyed the ancient city of Ashur, the spiritual center of the Assyrian world. Then they laid siege to Nineveh, the capital. After 3 months of relentless assault, the walls were breached and the city fell. King Sinsharishkun died during the battle, either slain or by his own hand. The fall of Nineveh was a death blow, symbolic and strategic. Though remnants of the Assyrian army regrouped at Haran, they were defeated again in 610 BCE. By 609 BCE, the last vestiges of the empire were swept away. What had once been the most powerful force in the known world vanished completely, its cities in ruins, its people scattered, and its legacy reduced to fragments carved into stone. The Assyrian Empire, the first of its kind, was gone. The sudden and total collapse of the Assyrian Empire stunned the ancient world. Just decades earlier, its kings had ruled over lands from Egypt to Persia, and now nothing remained but scorched earth and broken walls. No successor state rose from its ashes to claim its mantle. Unlike Egypt, which rebounded after foreign occupations, or Babylon, which experienced multiple revivals, Assyria simply ceased to exist. Its language faded, its gods were forgotten, and its cities were left to decay beneath layers of sand and time. The people of the region, once fearful of the brutal Assyrian armies, began to speak of them only in whispers, as cautionary tales of arrogance, cruelty, and divine punishment. Ancient scribes from neighboring civilizations often portrayed Assyria's fall as a moral reckoning, a cosmic response to its excesses. The very terror that had built its empire also ensured that few mourned its passing. The ruins of Nineveh and Ashur stood as grim reminders of what happens when an empire overreaches, fueled by a vision of supremacy that leaves no room for diplomacy, cooperation, or cultural tolerance. Even its administrative achievements, once revolutionary, were buried under the weight of its own violence. In seeking to become eternal, Assyria became a warning, etched into history not as a legacy to be admired, but as one to be remembered with caution. And yet, the story of Assyria is not merely one of brutality and destruction. It also represents the complexities of early statehood, the struggle to unify diverse peoples, and the ambition to create something lasting in a world of constant upheaval. For all its violence, the empire laid down the foundation for many systems that later civilizations would adopt and refine. Organized military units, provincial governance, courier networks, infrastructure development, and imperial law. In many ways, Assyria was the prototype for the empires that followed. Its rulers, despite their ruthlessness, understood that power required more than conquest. It needed structure, ideology, and control. They pioneered ways to hold vast lands together, and their efforts echoed across centuries. The paradox of Assyria lies in this duality. It was both a beacon of innovation and a harbinger of tyranny. While its collapse serves as a grim conclusion, it also opens a broader understanding of how civilizations rise and fall. History would not forget Assyria, even if the land itself did. Its influence seeped into the cultures that succeeded it, from the Babylonians to the Persians, and its ruins would one day teach archaeologists and historians the scale and scope of its accomplishments. Assyria, though fallen, left behind a blueprint of empire that would shape the world long after it disappeared. What truly sets Assyria apart in the chronicles of human history is not just the sheer magnitude of its territorial reach, but the intensity with which it pursued dominance, militarily, spiritually, and ideologically. Its rulers did not merely seek to expand for wealth or resources. They believed they were enacting a cosmic mandate. The king was more than a sovereign. He was the executor of divine will, the expansion of borders, the suppression of revolts, the crushing of cities. All of it was justified as part of Ashur's grand design. This belief system forged an empire that did not hesitate, did not compromise, and rarely forgave. Yet this same conviction blinded its leaders to the changing world around them. Where diplomacy and adaptation could have preserved their dominance, they chose instead to cling to fear and rigidity. As enemies grew more unified and internal fractures widened, Assyria found itself fighting ghosts of its own making. Resentments planted generations earlier now returned to haunt it. The lack of succession planning, the endless reliance on conquest to fund state machinery, and the unchecked brutality all contributed to a downfall that in hindsight seems inevitable. Still, few civilizations have left behind a legacy as paradoxical, feared in life, erased in death, and yet forever embedded in the DNA of empires yet to come. In the end, the story of Assyria is not just a tale of rise and fall, but a powerful reminder of the delicate balance between strength and sustainability. The Assyrians taught the ancient world what an empire could be: cohesive, innovative, far-reaching. But they also showed the cost of ruling through terror and the danger of mistaking fear for loyalty. Empires may be built on the sword, but they cannot be maintained by it alone. The Assyrians fell not because they were weak, but because they never learned when to stop. Their greatness became their undoing, their ambition their downfall. And yet, within that tragic arc, lies a lesson that has echoed through millennia. Power without wisdom is fragile, and even the mightiest can fall. From their ashes, others would rise, emulating their innovations while avoiding their mistakes. In the silence that followed their collapse, a new era began, one shaped by those who remembered not only what Assyria achieved, but what it failed to become. The empire may have vanished, but its story endures, not merely as a chronicle of conquest, but as a monument to the human struggle for meaning, control, and endurance in a world forever shifting. In that story, Assyria remains alive, not in stone or sovereignty, but in the lessons it left behind. Assyria's story is one of triumph, tragedy, and transformation. But what did it mean to you? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Was there a moment that struck you most Your feedback shapes the future of this channel.